Yes, Chase, it is on the internet and it started recording. All right, so welcome, everybody. Thank you for spending time with us after school today. That's so nice of you. Thank you so much. All right. What we're going to talk about today is a little bit of review of the different content material from AP US History. What we're going to talk about today, as you will see in a second, is primarily the College Board's period 1, 2, and 3. This roughly corresponds to our units 1 and 2. So your units 1 and 2 notes, that's just kind of what's going to apply to what we're going to talk about today. Now you're seeing on the board right here these different percentages. This is the proportion that it could be represented on the AP. And you're noticing that for these early periods, not a lot of representation on the AP. Period 1 and 2 especially, not that prevalent on the AP exam. In addition, you are not going to get a DBQ about anything in period 1 or 2. This is prime area, though, for an LEQ or an SAQ. Last year, there was an SAQ from period 1, and there was an LEQ from period 2, actually. So these periods do matter for the AP, but they serve mostly as historical context, which is a big skill on the AP, especially for FRQ writing. Now, the way that this review session is going to work is that we are going to go through the different course themes of the AP College Board curriculum. The AP divides up the content of this class into these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different themes. And they talk about things like America and national identity, work exchange technology, geography. You can read the rest right there. Now, we're going to break this up based on the AP's units, as I just said earlier. But let's go ahead and get started with the first one right here. Now, what the heck does this actually mean right here? American and national identity. What this means is, what does it mean to be an American politically? What political values does our country have? What do we believe in terms of government, in terms of individual liberty? Now, the College Board does not have anything actually from period 1, but that is because most of our political traditions derive themselves from English political systems. The English are a profoundly important influence on how America eventually develops. We speak English. We're primarily descended from the English colonies. Now, what are the origins of American ideas in terms of politics, in terms of political philosophy? Well, as much as we like to clown on the Puritans were a big influence on what becomes the United States. The Puritans, as you might remember, they came to the United States, what becomes the United States, I should say, because of the motivation to create a religious community. And this is important in terms of American national identity because that it helps explain what becomes American exceptionalism. We're the greatest country in the freaking world. And that is best represented by John Winthrop's sermon, the City on a Hill sermon. Really quickly, what other president referenced the City on a Hill speech in his farewell address? This one you might not remember, but who remembers a president, a socially conservative president who was elected in 1980, who might have referenced the City on a Hill speech? Yes, Reagan, Mr. Ronnie Reagan. So right there, you see connections between different time periods. The idea of American exceptionalism. We are the greatest freaking country in the world. We should be an example to the rest of the world. Our system of democracy, our system of religion is superior to everybody else. But politically as well, the nature of the founding of the country, of the colonies, I should say, it also will reflect the democratic traditions of the United States. Most of the English colonies in North America were founded by joint stock companies. Who remembers what a joint stock company is? This goes back to your World and Euro info as well. Joint stock company. I'm going to stand here all day until, yes, read. Exactly. It is a non-government owned corporation where there is division based on stock ownership. And that actually reflects the nature of the American colonies because a joint stock company is democratic. If you own stock in the company, you have a voice in the company's politics. And that reflects kind of the creation of representative governments in the colonies. In Virginia, there was the House of Burgesses. In Massachusetts, there was the General Court. But Americans also value freedom of speech, wink, wink. The idea is that Americans value individual civil liberties. And actually, the origins of that can go back to the colonial period. In the early 1700s, there was the so-called Zenger trial. John Peter Zenger, he was a German publisher. Does anybody remember the story behind Mr. Zenger? Yeah, Ruby. Exactly. The one thing I will criticize, though, is that he was criticizing the governor of the colony of New York, William Crosby. Not William Cosby, that's a different guy. So the freedom of speech is established through kind of the traditions of the Zenger trial. But Americans are also secular and religiously tolerant for the most part. We do have this idea of religious tolerance. It goes back to the founding of the colonies themselves. The Quakers, which colony did that group of people go to? Who remembers the Quakers? Yeah, Pennsylvania, excellent. The Puritans, Massachusetts. Who went to Maryland? What group of people went to Maryland? Mary, the mother of God, yes. Catholics, example. Exactly. Oh, Jesus. I'm having a stroke right now. So that is kind of a big tradition right there. Religious tolerance. It's eventually adopted into our First Amendment. Great. But we also see that America's national identity kind of formed during the colonial period because of that idea of salutary neglect. Remember, salutary neglect was the concept of kind of letting the colonies do their own thing. For the most part, England did not have a heavy hand in governing their colonies. The colonies were allowed to tax themselves, have their own representation locally. And as such, it does create this feeling that maybe we're American and not British. The First Great Awakening as well, that contributed to a sense of religious diversity in the United States. But moving ahead to the Revolutionary period, the period 1754 to 1800 is the Revolutionary period in American history. And kind of politically, what do we value from this period? Well, this is a rich area because this is where America was factually founded. The Constitution, Declaration of Independence, it all derives itself from the Enlightenment. Now, this is your AP World and Euro knowledge right here. The Enlightenment, that intellectual movement, is the basis of American political thought in the present day. Some of the big ideas of the Enlightenment are expressed in the following ways. For one thing, the Enlightenment, especially more radical figures, were opposed to the idea of birthright nobility, that you were given a special title and position in life because God said so. Remember, back before the Enlightenment, there was a concept that existed in Europe and in its colonies known as the Great Chain of Being. This essentially was the idea that all society is ordered based on a set hierarchy. There's God on top, there's kings, there's nobles, and then there's everybody else on bottom. This is natural. It is God-given. But the Enlightenment is going to say, heck no to that. They are going to embrace a more secular approach to social systems. Remember, one of the biggest values of many of the American revolutionaries was a meritocracy. Who remembers what a meritocracy is? Yes.
Where your place in society is determined by your work.
Exactly. Your value, what you do, the things you do. Exactly. Many of the founding fathers were also practicing deists as well. And that's going to influence the kind of secular nature of the early American Republic. The phrase separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, but it is a value that many founding fathers had, like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, for example. But another big issue of the time is this idea of actual versus virtual representation. Now, I want you to talk to your neighbor 15 seconds. What do you remember about the difference between actual versus virtual representation? What do you remember, if anything? Go ahead, talk to your neighbor. Yeah, that's fine. All right. So, what's the difference between actual and virtual representation? Yes, my son.
Like faith in the monarch.
Yeah.
Actual representation of we actually have representatives for it.
Representatives need to come from the communities they represent in government. That's actual representation. Virtual representation is, by virtue of being a part of the British Empire, you're represented in the British government. The Americans didn't like that. That contributed to the growing independence movement. The two most important documents from this period you need to know is Common Sense. Who wrote Common Sense real quick? Yeah, Kirtana. Thomas Paine, T-Pain, my favorite rapper. Exactly. Common Sense. No one laughed at that joke. Whatever. Common Sense, secularism, opposition. Thank you for clapping. Opposition to aristocracy. Declaration of Independence. What's the most famous phrase from the Declaration of Independence? That's a big question, but what's the most famous one? All men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights that among these include... Yes. Yes, there we go. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Excellent. But guess what? Women, you guys have a responsibility too because of the concept of Republican motherhood. You, women, or I should say, you don't have to be mothers, obviously. I'm not saying any of, whatever. Women, mothers, they have a responsibility to encourage democratic values in their children. Teach them the ways of George Washington. Teach them how to be good citizens. So in a way, we are promoting the idea of democratic values even amongst our children. All right. Any questions so far? Awesome sauceum, apple possum.
Okay, switch out here. Mr. Antrusky and I are taking turns here. So with that, let's take a look at this other theme here. This is going to involve work exchange and technology. So basically kind of the nuts and bolts of the economic systems of the class so far. So different types of economy, what really matters there, government systems surrounding it, and just things that we do to make it go better or worse. So this is where the first of that period one stuff begins to come in, because we do see the very first thing we looked at in this class was about Native American societies. And the economy, as we think of it there very briefly, is quite different. We saw that Native American societies, their concept of money doesn't exactly exist. There was concepts of trade. There was real egalitarian societies. They shared with each other. No one was poor. They did a lot of stuff to boost their farming systems. Among the things we saw, there was like the Mississippi culture and the giant city of Cahokia. We saw irrigation, just like other early societies. We even went into South America and saw things like terrace farming and chiampas. And we even saw those really cool three sisters. And real quick, just everyone remember what those were, what the three sisters were real quick? There was, yeah. That's one. Maize.
And something else.
Wash. So yeah, we saw that kind of countering that idea of Native Americans as like just less developed. There was a lot of things they did that improved their own economy. Like how three sisters enriched the soil, protected each other. They were great symbiotic crops. And so it was a difference in style. Meanwhile, we saw a more European version when we looked at European exploration. We saw those snazzy Latin sails, their triangular sails. We can go against the wind now. We can sail around the world way more easily. We got the compass and the caravel, all these new fangled inventions means Europeans are showing up in America in large numbers here. Real quick, the answer's on the board here, but anyone remember, why did the French come to this part of the world in the first place? Anyone remember? Yeah. That was actually the results of what happened, but that's not the cause. They were looking for something else. Anyone remember? Yeah, I don't.
Go away to India.
So, I mean, technically, they were looking for a northwestern passage right up there at the top right there. Again, yeah, the Spanish were looking for a way around. But yeah, the French were looking for a Northwestern Passage. They didn't find it, but they did find Canada and beaver with it. Now, once all these Europeans began showing up, we saw that they then set cash crops in several areas. We saw down in the Indies, right down there, but then we also saw in the southern colonies, all these very profitable crops. They became immensely popular. Real quick, just talk to your neighbors. What are some examples of a cash crop? Just take 30 seconds. What are some examples? Go ahead. All right, what else? Real quick, someone remind me, what is cash crops? What do we see? Yeah. Tobacco, that's one of them for sure. What else? Yeah. Sugar, what else? Yeah. There you go. I mean,
That is
Sorry.
actually a very important thing right there. The AP does not consider cotton as valuable of a cash crop in this time period until the cotton gin. That is much later in this class.
I'm not gonna lie, I misheard you. I thought you said cacao, which is like the cocoa bean thing. Yeah.
Yeah, that
So-
was it.
Yeah, so you're half right. So anyhow, basically, these are very profitable, they are desirable, they become all around the world, big markets. And at the same time, we also need people to work on these cash crops. So it's right here, we start to see the beginning of a major shift. We have the beginning of that slave labor there, the Middle Passage, people being transported from Africa, being just hand in hugely dense numbers. 20% don't even survive the journey, you might remember. Others rebel, others just get free and jump off the side of the boat. Like it was a horrific exploitation system, but for the Europeans running it, it became very profitable to just bring a bunch of slaves from Africa, work them till death, and just replace them. But at the same time, we saw that the Spanish system's a little different. We do see similar types of labor, like in the encomienda system, but anyone remember what the difference between like the Spanish labor system and the English one? Like we see these kind of slave labor going on here, but Spanish, what do they do? Yeah. Yeah, so we see the people that are kind of already there are being subjugated. And well, over time, we do see that the shift does happen where Native Americans are kind of phased out and African Americans become the default labor system because, among other reasons, we saw Native Americans knew the land and kept escaping to be never seen again. But we also saw that they kept getting wiped out by diseases as they had been ever since the Europeans started arriving. So we see other types of systems here, but we do see that different things are causing different groups to come here. What were those 3 Gs that why Spain's coming in the first place? Anyone remember? Yeah. Yeah, I didn't want to say it out loud because people say the order differently. I say God, gold, glory. Some say God, glory, gold. But yeah, we see, yeah, always God first. But yeah. So it's a good idea to know the different reasons why Europeans are coming here and for what reasons. So we see that, yeah, Spain is largely those God, gold, glory. The others are more economic, but we do see it depends on the colony. At the same time, we see now moving into that second period here, once the Europeans have been settled, we now have the massive triangle trade. And so we are seeing the beginning of that big system, slaves to North America. We then see raw, unrefined goods go into Europe. Europe then sends the refined goods back and forth. So we are seeing just this massive system here. And at the same time, we're seeing that this is kind of how the American colony, the colonial colonies begin to start mixing up a little bit here. So we saw, in general, there are 3 regions to the country in regards to the colonies. There is the north, the middle colonies, and the south. So we saw the north does not really do the cash crops because the climate doesn't benefit it. But what they do have is a lot of other stuff. They have things like the big heavy forests. They are involved in like the shipbuilding economy from England. We see the middle colonies. They have trade goods and they are helping with the idea of different furs. And it's mostly in the south that we see those cash crops going on. And so at the same time, we had that guns and fur trade cycle there, where we have Native Americans are giving fur to Europeans in exchange for guns. And who are they using the guns on? Do you remember? Like, in general, Native Americans are using those guns for who? Yeah.
Oh, against our Native Americans.
Yeah, it's to escalate tribal conflicts. So we see that because Native Americans are not a monolith, they don't unite against these white oppressors. Instead, use them to further hostility with each other. All right. Any questions about any of that before we move on here? Cool. So just very quickly looking at other side here. We also saw, going back to world, there was that mercantilism. So we see that the colonies really couldn't trade with anyone else except for Great Britain. And so we have different levels there of enforcement. Does anyone remember what that phrase salutary neglect was about? Yeah, read.
Being less involved in colonial things.
Yeah, you're technically not wrong. Yeah, basically, we're seeing that there are rules on the surface that involve restrictions on trade, but in different areas, they are going to be less enforced. And so early on, we saw that because they couldn't really enforce it in a timely fashion, England was pretty hands-off for a while. But we do see that changes over time. We had those navigation acts that are actually putting laws in place to enforce salutary neglect. And then eventually, there's even a point where the area of New England just gets overthrown and replaced with a colonial government, like a police state. Dominion New England, well, the result, though, is that the king at home got overthrown about it, among other reasons. But at the same time, we also saw the nature of slavery is kind of diverse here. So we see that slavery is in every colony. It's just a matter of by how much. We saw the South is obviously the ones that have the cash crops and the biggest population, but every colony has it. But in some colonies, they might be outnumbered by indentured servants. So we saw that is, a little more of an amiable system. You could come from the old world, potentially get a bit of land. If you survive your indentured servant time, you might get some land and have a pretty good setup. Problem is, we saw Bacon's Rebellion. Take a second here, talk to your neighbors here. What do you remember about Bacon's Rebellion? Go ahead. All right, folks. All right, who wants to take me through Bacon's Rebellion based on what we remember real quick? Yeah, Tom.
Like going to the Native American, they were like attacking him, and the governor decided not to help him attack them back, so he made his indentured servants do it. I don't know how it turned out, but I don't think it went very well.
Well, they burned down Jamestown.
Oh.
So, yeah, the other thing, nice. Real quick though, adding to that, does anyone remember why they went into Native American lands? Because that's kind of important there. So, yeah.
They were really bad land.
So the natural consequence of the indentured servitude system is we start promising more and more people land, more people become indentured servants to get land, we start running out of space. So we see land gets further and further westward into more hostile territory. And so eventually relations with Native Americans break down, and we see a group of indentured servants just goes and invades Native American land. And so it became a system where we see laborers demand rights. And this whole system made that very clear. So once the rebellion is ultimately put down, this scared a lot of colonies away from indentured servitude and towards slavery. Instead of using workers that have rights, we should use workers that don't have rights, to put it bluntly. And so to kind of wrap up here, let's see, looking at other issues there, we saw different types of ownership, different types of slavery, chattel slavery, where slaves effectively are property. Moving on here, looking in the era after the revolution, we saw that the new country does not have a lot of industry. We saw that effectively, since we had mercantilism, we don't really make stuff for ourselves. How are we going to fix that? Well, we saw Alexander Hamilton tried a few things to try and balance the economy. One, we just had to rely on France to get us a lot of supplies during the war, even before they sent us soldiers. So this is a plan to try and pay off those debts, creating a national debt. And he was in favor of industrializing the country. We see that was naturally opposed by the Southern people who, one, don't have any debts because, to quote the musical, they don't pay for labor. And two, they saw it as an infringement on their core beliefs. So we see that effectively there is a big growing question about how we should finance the country. And here's the beginning of that issue of federal rights versus states' rights. Effectively, how do we dig ourselves out of it? All right, just in general, the South wanted to support yeoman farmers, independent farmers, and states' rights. Any questions about that before moving on here? All right, switching gears, let's see.
And I would highlight whatever you don't remember, whatever kind of we didn't really talk about all that much in this review session. Just highlight what you might want to review in your own time after this review session. All right, now we're going to get to one of the easiest actions or aspects of the AP and what information you would need to know there. In period 1, you kind of just need to know where different Native American societies are and what they produce. So, taking a look at the map for a second right here, and the viewers at home get a little bit, not the information here. But when we talk about the Southwest, that's our Native Americans in this part of the United States. That's Native Americans like the Navajo, Native Americans like the Anasazi, the Hohokam. All of these different Native American groups are predominantly agricultural, sedentary indigenous people. That's how they interact with the natural environment. Shifting gears a bit, the area that we mean by the Great Basin and the Midwest, you should have an understanding of where these things are. So, the Great Basin and the Midwest, that's this region of the United States. Predominantly, these Native Americans, they tend to be hunter-gatherer nomads. They're primarily following what animal? What big old animal are they? The buffalo, well, bison technically is more accurate, but yeah, the bison, the buffalo, whatever. Whatever. So, hunter-gatherers. Now you move over here to the northeast. This northeast region right here, aka New England, this is where the Iroquois live. And the Iroquois were predominantly a mixture of sedentary and hunter-gatherer society. So, they would have permanent locations, they would farm things like those three sisters, but they would also rely on hunting animals, especially things like beaver. Now, moving over here to the Pacific Northwest. This is this region, the West Coast right here. This was an area by the Nez Perce. This is an area primarily that is sedentary, but it does rely on greater fishing and whaling, especially. How humans interact with their environment is a big part of the AP. The Mississippi River area, that is also similar to New England, to the northeast of the United States. The other major aspect of period 1 of the geography and environmental aspect of American history is the Columbian Exchange. Talk to your neighbor. What was the Columbian Exchange? What goods came from the Americas? What goods went to the Americas? Go ahead and talk to your neighbor. All right. So, Columbian Exchange. What goods go from the Americas to Europe? What are some of the goods from the Americas going to Europe? Yes. Potatoes. You boil them, you stick them in a stew. Yes, potatoes is a big one. Anything else you can think of? Read. Potatoes and tomatoes. Excellent. All right. Anything else you can think of? Those are the two biggest ones, but yeah. Corn. Yeah, that's another one. Yes, corn, potatoes, and tomatoes. That's my Saturday night right there. All right. What about goods coming from Europe to the Americas? What are some of those? Yes. Horses is the really big one. What else? Did you have one each? Yes. Diseases, that's the other major one. Diseases like smallpox, like influenza. Excellent. Anything else from the old world coming to the new world? Yes. I was going to try and lead you to that. Yes, sugar. Sugar is not indigenous to the Americas, but it grows super well in the Americas. Excellent. All right. Speaking of kind of the environment, in terms of the non-English colonizers, the French and the Dutch tended to not have a lot of immigrants actually go to North America. These places, these people, the French and the Dutch, predominantly were fur traders up here in modern-day Canada and along the Mississippi River for the French. The Dutch, of course, were predominantly here in modern-day New York. Anybody remember what the Dutch called this region right here? Yeah. That's what they called when we come to New York City. They called the entire colony New Netherlands. So New Amsterdam is the major port city. But the Spanish, on the other hand, they were more of an urbanized group, especially closer to the equator. Spanish immigration to the Americas predominantly was in urban centers in the Caribbean and the Mexico. But we also see that the Spanish, when they colonized what becomes the United States up here in kind of the shit region of the United States, not a lot of immigrants actually came here. It's dry, it's dusty. No one wants to live in Tucson, Arizona. Worst place ever. All right. Okay, yeah, Gadsden Purchase or whatever. All right. Now, moving ahead a little bit. In terms of the regions for English colonization, the first English colonies are going to be right here in the Chesapeake. The AP sometimes likes to use this term, so you need to know what it refers to. The Chesapeake is Virginia and Maryland. It is this region right here. This is the first area of colonization. After the Chesapeake is settled, then we're going to see colonization up here of New England. New England specifically refers to places like Massachusetts, for example. After the settlement of the South and the North, this is where we get the middle colonies, aka the mid-Atlantic colonies. The mid-Atlantic colonies include New York and Pennsylvania. Sometimes you might get an SAQ or an LEQ asking you to compare these different regions. And these different regions have different economies. They have different societies as well, different political systems. In the South, in the Chesapeake and in the Southern colonies, what is the major economy production there? It is, say it all together, cash crops, exactly. What about in New England? What is the major products produced in New England? Yes. Not yet, no. Someone said it over there. Timber, exactly. What else? Ooh, I'm a little beast in the sea. I'm going like this. I'm a beast in the sea. What? Whales and fish. Yeah, whales and fish. All right. A beast in the sea, a fish, exactly. All right. Middle colonies, what is produced there? Predominantly grain. Things like wheat and corn that is sold into the Caribbean. All right. Speaking of geography really quick, guess what is between the United States and England? A big freaking ocean. This ocean is going to contribute to that feeling of cultural and political separation. All right, not a lot about the geography in the Revolutionary period, but a little bit of the information here. For one thing, the War for Independence, we kind of won that war because of home field advantage. American colonists knew their homesteads. They knew their locations. They were able to effectively mount a guerrilla war against an imperialist power. Doesn't it sound familiar to anything else we might have talked about in this class? A guerrilla war against a technologically superior nation? Yeah, Vietnam War, perhaps. So, a lot of similarities right there. The war in the South especially was a guerrilla war. We didn't talk about Francis Marion, I don't think, but he was kind of a guerrilla fighter. He was the so-called Swamp Fox, which is my nickname. No, it's not. The South and the North, these places will continue. I forgot that we're recording. I'm sorry. cash crops in the south and in the north as well. We've got timber and natural harbors. All right. Are there any questions about geography in these time periods right here? All right, here you go, Mr. Paul.
All right, let's migrate away from that for a second there. Let's take a look at how people are moving around the country. So we saw it much more in the later units, but there is always kind of a focus on like where people are going in regards to moving around in the country or coming to this country, and also where they're coming from and why. So we saw that among the Native American blocks, there were some that were sedentary, like what we saw in the Southwest. But we also saw in areas like the Great Plains and a little bit in the Northeast, there are movements. We saw that there are some Native American groups that are constantly nomadic following the buffalo, others move seasonally. And so we're seeing that it was a constant area of rotation, meaning that the place that they called home was constantly in flux. Now, we kind of saw this already here about how not a lot of French, Spanish, and Dutch people came here, but the ones that did, we saw the different types of styles like the encomienda system or these kind of like little trade posts here and there. Now, the people that actually do come to this country, we saw that oftentimes they're running away from something. We saw that the people that were coming to the New World in regards to religious persecution are a few different groups here. One, in France around this era, I say this wrong every time, it's the Huguenot, right? Something like that. I said Huguenots, but whatever. So we see that there are religious minorities that are being persecuted in the old world. They're going to flee and start a whole new life out here. The French are going to land up in the area by the St. Lawrence River, up in this area north of Spain. And so it's one reason why a big part of Canada speaks French to this day. We see that there was also the idea of Jewish people coming, and we'll see that a few different groups are going to land in places like Pennsylvania in the next unit here. But at the same time, we do see very early on, due to these wars of colonization, the beginning of a really dark trend of Native American people being forced off their land and being forced to move further and further west. Now, moving into the second period there, what we do see is it'd be a good idea to know about why people are leaving the old world, places like England, and looking at places like America. So one, we saw that Europe is kind of a mess right now. The access to Asia and India has been kind of cut off by the whole Ottoman monopoly and the Venetian city-states. We saw that Europe is crowded. England is a cesspool right now, disease, overpopulation. It is ugly. But there's also the whole idea of the Anglican Church being very aggressive about who it likes and who it doesn't, who it does not. And even we see that there is not a lot of stuff, even if you're all going right, if you have the misfortune of not being the beneficiary of primogeniture. Does anyone remember what that means, primogeniture? Aiden.
Like the eldest brother.
Yeah, and the rest get diddly squat. So we see, that's an old phrase from the 2000s right there. So we see that there is basically not a lot of reason to even stay in this overcrowded, bankrupt country if you're not the firstborn. So we see a lot of secondborns and lower start moving this way. Some become indentured servants, some start fresh. Now, so with that in mind, people come to America. There's wide open spaces, tracts of land. We have a chance to get land. If you want to become an indentured servant, then you have a chance of owning a house and having titles and land. We see that there is far less oppression out here. And so with that in mind, that takes us to the regions of the colonies here. Again, it's a good idea to know the different regions of the colonies and what their goals were. So we saw that basically the South area, with the exception of Maryland, is mostly just for making cash crops. We see that this is where the worst of the Middle Passage happens. This is where more of a marketplace economy happens. It's less like entire families moving and more like businessmen, workers, and slaves being sent there just to make gigantic plantations. However, we do see, as we covered earlier, Maryland. So hey, Catholics for the win. Meanwhile, in New England, we saw that there's that idea there of fleeing that persecution. These different groups here, this new group that we're going to call the Puritans, they show up. So we saw that they were trying to reach Virginia. They end up missing and landing on Plymouth Rock, Massachusetts. And well, once they're there, then they start focusing on building entirely new communities. They want to create a whole different community here, purifying the Anglican Church by being a better example, that city on the hill. Does anyone remember the differences between the Puritans and the Pilgrims, actually? Like, this is a tricky one here. The Puritans wanted to purify, yeah.
Yeah, one was like, oh, hey, we just straight up do not want to work with another one was like, we kind of agree with it, but we don't want, things to work.
So yeah, the Puritans want to purify the church by being a better example. The Pilgrims, who technically got here first, they want to separate from the Anglican Church entirely. And so, at the same time, then we saw up in the middle colonies there, we saw a lot of those religious minorities. As we covered in Pennsylvania, if you were a different minority, especially in places like Germany, then you could come here and there was a fair amount of religious tolerance, at least early on. Now, at the same time, we saw due to the slave trade, a lot of West African traditions are being spread in places like the Indies, places like the Deep South. So we kind of see the beginning of this syncretism here of mixing traditional African styles of culture and dance with more European styles of Christianity or culture or the like. And so a lot of this kind of shaped the African American culture of the South to this day. And then, as we mentioned already, Bacon's Rebellion, people are never happy with enough land. They're just going to keep going and grabbing more. On that note, so we saw that as we're going on, there was a desire to just keep expanding. And that's kind of what led to the whole French-Indian War. We saw that there was a desire to push forward and conquer this French territory. And so ultimately, as it starts way down by a youngin named George Washington, well, it starts off accidentally, it starts World War Zero. And well, the result is that Britain becomes the superpower of the world. We see that once that happens, they kind of vacate the North American continent. So once that happens, the British colonies expand into that area, and ultimately they're going to stomp on a couple of Native American groups on the way. Pontiac's Rebellion, dealing with an encroaching further northeast. We see the result here is that the king declares the proclamation line in 1763, no one settles west of the Appalachians. And that will hold true for a little bit. And then they're going to ignore it and keep going anyways. So when does that happen? Once Britain's not there to enforce it. Once America's independent, we decide that we have everything east of the Mississippi and we're going to use it. They keep expanding. We see even more tensions, the Battle of Fallen Timbers being another example of a war between Native Americans. But we also see a further increase in regional identity now. It doesn't matter so much the colonies anymore, so much as whether if you're from the north, the south, or now the west. And so we kind of focused on this in later units with like the 36 by 30 line. But another one, I don't know if it appears on the AP so much anymore. It was around when I was here. One that they like you to know sometimes is called the Mason-Dixon line. And so it's a cultural thing. It's right about here. And it's basically the division between north and south in the more eastern side of the country. So any questions about that right there? It's good to know basically the differences culturally between north, south, and now the west showing up. All right. Cool. Halfway there, folks.
All right, we are almost done. Let's keep going. So, politics and power. This is the big old complicated one right here. Politics and power is political system, as the name might suggest. In period one, kind of some of the ideas to understand is that tribal governments, Native American societies, tended to be what we would call decentralized. There really isn't that authoritarian central figure in a lot of Native American societies. I think the exceptions, though, would be the Aztec and the Inca. We don't really talk about them that much in this class, but kind of some exceptions to that. But something that is more richly present on the AP is comparing the English, the French, and the Dutch, and the Spanish. The Spanish and the French, these governments during this time are absolutist monarchies, as you might remember from World and Euro last year. As such, these absolutist countries tended to have more government supervision of the colonies. There was no concept of salutary neglect, as there was in the English colonies. But speaking of the English colonies, let's go ahead and talk about those. England is a weird country in the terms of its political system. England is not an absolutist monarchy. Rather, it is a constitutional monarchy, aka a mixed government. And kind of that nature of a constitution will definitely influence the American political system. We are a constitutional republic. England is a constitutional monarchy. However, despite the fact that England does have a system of representation with parliament, it goes back to this issue of virtual representation. Because of this idea of implied representation, there's not any English colony representation in parliament. The colonies, if you will, are taxed without their representation. But another tradition that is common in the United States is the notion of common law. Common law is a concept that basically emphasizes judges and juries. If you're accused of a crime, which I know one of you will be one day, you have a jury to determine if you're guilty or not. However, another big thing that's going to change across the 1700s and the 1600s is this level of government control. There's kind of stages of the British Empire. First, it's benign abandonment, let them do their own thing. Then it's kind of this age of mercantilism. Then it's the age of salutary neglect when it becomes too expensive to enforce mercantilism. So initially, remember, the colonies were mostly self-governing. They were joint stock companies that were democratically represented. But as time goes on, England starts to clamp down on the colonies. The Navigation Acts, the Dominion of New England, these are two examples of English government control over the colonies. But it's expensive to maintain mercantilism, so we did see this transition towards salutary neglect. All the same time, though, the colonies have their own distinct constitutional systems of government. We see the emphasis is on actual representation. And we've talked about all of these concepts before: local democracy, local religious freedom, and local taxes. Who could vote in the colonies? What groups of people, what group of people could vote in the colonies? Yes. Men specifically. What other qualifications? Landowners. There's one other, white, exactly. White landowning men over 21. All right. But let's talk about now the American Revolution. There is a lot in this particular lesson section. Now, before the Revolution, this is where we saw those ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas like the concept of popular democracy. And all of that will influence the calls for independence as time goes on. The one thing that we didn't cover in detail was the Albany Plan of Union. Anybody remember who proposed the Albany Plan? Yeah. The sexiest founding father, Benjamin Franklin. Exactly. It was this proposed American parliament that would represent the 13 colonies in North America. Now, the revolution is won. It is fought against the British. We get our independence. The thing that we have to focus on now is what our government looks like after independence. Initially, the government of the United States was under the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles, as you might remember from Unit 2, were pretty sucky overall. They were not very effective intentionally. And the reason why is kind of that reflection of opposition to tyranny. Now, these are all reasons why the Articles were not that effective. But the areas where they were effective, land ordinances, Northwest ordinances. Does anybody remember either of these acts right here? Yeah. You could buy a patch of land and the money goes to the federal government. Excellent. What about the Northwest ordinances? Yeah. It sets up not just the tradition of statehood, of equal representation for new states, but it also denied slavery in the Northwest region. Excellent. Now, Articles suck so bad, we get a new system of government, the Constitution. Now, the Constitution is going to be the replacement of the Articles. And you do need to know a little bit about the Constitution. The Constitution has 3 branches. This is that reflection of the separation of power. It's an Enlightenment idea. But the Constitution also sets up a system of federalism. Federalism in general is the division of power between a national government and local governments. That's a huge area of debate across American history. Do we have more government power for the federal government or for local state governments? But another big thing about the Constitution is the issue of compromises. Now, big states, states with a lot of population like Virginia, what type of government did they want? What was their ideal system of government? Who remembers kind of the big states plan for the Constitution? Yes. Representation based on population. That would overly favor places like Virginia and New York, for example. What about small states? What was their proposed plan for what the new government would look like? So if not based on population, then what based on? Equal representation. Every state, regardless of size, would have the same amount of representatives. That was the New Jersey plan. The big state plan was the Virginia plan. However, eventually the compromise is reached where we have the Great Compromise. This is what sets up the bicameral legislation. In other words, it's where the Senate and the House of Representatives comes from. Which government body has equal representation in Congress? Yes. No. Yes. The Senate, exactly. Which then is based on population. Read. Which one is then, if it's not the Senate, then it's the House of Representatives. Oh my gosh. The Senate is based on equal representation, 2 senators from each state. Population-based is the House of Representatives. All right, what about slavery, though? Southern states, why did they want slavery, or what did they think about slavery and representation? What was their beef? What was their whole issue about? Should slaves count as property, or should slaves count as people? Why might the slaves want, why might the Southern states want slaves counted towards population? Yes. Because then they get more representation in the House of Representatives. Excellent. However, what emerges is a compromise, the 3/5 compromise. For purposes of representation, the slave population counts as 3/5 of human beings. It gives the South an inordinate amount of representation in the federal government. So a compromise is eventually reached. We have the bicameral legislation. We've got the 3/5 compromise. However, in the ratification process, we saw 2 different factions emerge in the United States, the Anti-Federalists and the Federalists. The Federalists wanted the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists did not want the Constitution unless it had what? Who remembers the thing that the Anti-Federalists wanted? Yes. The Bill of Rights, exactly. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution that guarantee citizen protection from government interference. What are some of the amendments? Just throw any amendment out there. And the Bill of Rights, yes. Freedom of speech is the First Amendment. What else? Due process, Fifth Amendment. Anything else? Any other amendments that are important? Well, those are the 2 biggest ones, but yeah. Bear arms, Second Amendment. God bless America. All right. However, what wins over the Anti-Federalists is not just the promise of the Bill of Rights, but it's the Federalist Papers. For all you Hamilton fans out there, who are the 3 major authors of the Federalist Papers? There's a whole ass musical, yeah. John Jay, exactly. John Jay got sick after writing 5. James Madison wrote 25 or whatever. Hamilton wrote the other 51. That stupid musical. All right. Now, getting to when we're an actual country, post-Constitution, you do need to know the party systems of the United States. There are 6 of them in total. The first party system is between the Federalist Party, not the Federalist faction, and the Democratic Republicans. And you can read right here some of the summaries of the differences between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. You need to kind of know what the platforms are and who and where are they most popular. Are there any questions about kind of the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans? You should know difference based on constitutional interpretation and based on foreign policy. All right, really quickly, the Federalists believed in what was called loose construction. Who remembers what loose construction means? Austin. No. Yes.
Based on how, like, they can interpret them.
Yes, that's what it is. It is a more loose interpretation of the Constitution. The federal government can do whatever it wants as long as the Constitution doesn't prevent that. That's loose construction. What about strict construction by contrast? Yeah, read. Exactly. The government can only do what is explicitly said in the Constitution. There's nothing about a Bank of the United States in the Constitution. Hamilton shouldn't be allowed to have a Bank of the United States. All right. George Washington is the most important president from this time period you would need to know. He's important because he's neutral, but also of his farewell address. Really quickly, what are the two things he warned about in the farewell address? Just burn this in your memory. What's one thing?
Parties.
No parties, no political parties. What's the second one? Yes. Exactly. No entanglement in foreign affairs, no permanent military alliances. Excellent. You do need to know some elections for the AP. The one you need to know from this time period is the election of 1800. That's where your Hamilton knowledge comes into play. Election of 1800, it's called the Bloodless Revolution. Anybody remember who the major candidates were in the election of 1800? Yes. Aaron Burr was potentially a person. Yeah. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. That was the election where there was an even tie in the Electoral College, and it was determined by the House of Representatives. It's important because it is the first peaceful transfer of power from one party to another political party. That's the election with all the funny insults you might remember from Unit 2. All right, any questions? I know that was fast, but we have to get through a lot today.
Yeah. Speaking of, let's go ahead and shift gears now and take a look at effectively what counts as like foreign policy, just kind of America's relationship to the rest of the world. So this is kind of where we already saw them. We just covered earlier God, gold, and glory. In particular, those are kind of the reasons why Europeans are coming here in the first place. Now, you might remember the Spanish and the French are Catholics. Meanwhile, the Europeans, well, kind of a big question there. They are various offshoots of Anglican Protestant. And so with that in mind here, we see that also part of the reason here is that they're sending explorers to discover new things, acquire new resources, and generally increase their standing to then outcompete their rivals. So we saw there were different versions of that. We even saw some people looking for magic cities of gold over in the Southwest over here. We saw explorers, different routes to India, different trade routes or beaver trades, different notable explorers, among them Columbus, Samuel de Champlain, and the Henry Hudson, for whom the Hudson River is named up there. So we saw that in general, kind of already covered it, but Native Americans use the land differently, whereas Native Americans kind of lived in harmony with the natural world and only used the crops as needed. We saw Europeans would often kind of deforest entire areas, kind of create massive areas using crops like tobacco that then deplete the soil. We saw that there was a much more exploitative relationship, whereas Native Americans kind of lived the same way for a few thousand years, and it worked. We saw the idea of the doctrine of discovery. We now see that different European powers are just coming here and colonizing, planting a flag down because they're the first Europeans to get here first. Now, we also saw, though, that there is a few different things. One thing I want to point out, too, is that, well, we could go into lots of differences here. We saw that many Native American tribes were actually matrilineal. So like when a young man was old enough, he would actually go live with his mother's family, as opposed to the father. If a woman went and got married, they stayed with the mother's side of the family, not the dad's. So we see this kind of a fundamental split in ideologies and differences here. And that culture clash is one reason why things were so jarring. But it wasn't all bad per se. We did see that, for example, the French and the Dutch, they did not exactly want to kill their trading partners. So we saw they had a pretty good relationship, creating that kind of guns for fur trade. So they were amicable. They could work with each other. And well, we saw that because the situation had kind of resolved. Again, we're skipping over all the smallpox here, but we do see that the people that did survive, there was sort of a general mending of the two. Problem is, after a while, the Dutch and the French both get kicked off the continent, and then the British are the only ones left. And well, we saw how that went. Now, to be fair, the Spanish were pretty awful too. We saw the forced labor. We saw the working till death. We saw the destruction of the Aztec and the Incas within just 2 years. So like it was really quite jarring just how quickly things fell quickly. But we did see, among other ways of resisting, we saw that some Native Americans, once they were gone, they would just bolt and never be seen again. We saw that the Pueblo Revolt back in 1680, the whole area of New Mexico, they end up getting broken free. And for about 12 years, the area is reclaimed from the Spanish. We saw even with African Americans, some people who had come on ships managed to escape and live in those little maroon communities out in the Caribbean, entire communities based on helping others escape. So again, this was not just like a passive thing. People of color were resisting. Now, we do see that among the other things we just covered, there are different dynamics here. Again, we saw young men kind of marry into systems. So we have mixed blood people, mestizos, mulattoes, different types of categorizations. The Spanish had like 20 different categorizations there, but it means race relations are quite different. We have new divides, dividing lines. Again, the smallpox is spreading, but we also saw that European settlers also would get sick too. We saw that they would also contract other diseases, and if they survived, then they were immune. We call that the seasoning time back in like Jamestown and all that. And we also see different examples of fusion between the two of religion and culture, voodoo or Our Lady of Guadalupe, the kind of blending of local traditions and Christianity. Moving on, we saw that in regards to interactions between Native Americans and Europe, before America is its own thing, there is a lot of the same stuff happening. We saw that, I mean, in general, there was still some level of coexistence. We saw some level of the Pilgrims coexisting. We saw that John Smith and Powhatan, there was a bit of coexistence before it all fell apart and they shot each other. We saw that there was even some levels of political equivalency. The Iroquois Confederacy was powerful enough early on that they were actually able to be negotiated with, having a full-blown alliance with the English. And then they would use them to attack the French, or the French would ally with them to keep the British. So groups of the Iroquois were able to kind of exist between the margins of these two expanding European powers for as long as they could, until the day that they couldn't, and then they were the target again. Now, at the same time, we do see still more examples here. Metacom's War, another not so peaceful expansion here. We saw the Powhatan Wars. So again, once John Smith was gone, then things fall apart very quickly and a lot of bloody expansions happen. We did see, again, that earlier idea of Bacon's Rebellion though. So in general, we're seeing that this labor system is now going outdated. Now, as we're looking at this too, we mentioned earlier, in general, England is trying to outdo Spain and France. And you might remember going back to like the very beginning of Unit 1, like this area at one point was massive swamps. We saw that the English kind of took over this general area of the East Coast. We saw that the Spanish kind of had the area that would become the modern day Mexico, or like not modern day, but like the Mexican Cession, this whole area. And then the French kind of had Canada down all the way to the middle right here. So there was huge swaths of land that were taken over by different European powers. And what that meant was this became sort of a new battleground for competition. Lastly, we did see that different areas here kind of muddy the waters here. We saw that different examples of like Spanish people going up into areas like Florida, border disputes in regarding to future ideas like that. And so in general, we're seeing that there are still those issues of competition well into the days of when the 13 colonies are around. Now, looking at the next part though, we also saw that culturally, that idea of salutary neglect creates the whole thing, where after about leaving America alone, effectively for about 100 years, kind of created a unique American identity. And among that idea there is kind of this idea of self-determination, that they are not someone to be governed from so far away. And when the Navigation Acts at Dominion New England happened, Americans had a strong resentment about it because they had governed themselves for so long. They didn't like the idea of being governed by someone way the hell over there. Now, we kind of covered French and Indian War already. We saw that the biggest thing though there is that even though Britain wins and kicks France off, they are really out of money right now. So that's what leads to that idea of taxation. And once the crown tries to do that, we then saw that idea of self-determination really rear its ugly head. Taxation without representation. In particular, yeah, we don't have actual representatives in parliament and therefore have no say in this tax. Effectively, we didn't consent to this tax. And so we see that after a while, Britain didn't realize how severe the situation was. So they tried to clamp down even more. We saw the stamp tax. We saw the Townshend Acts. We saw the declaratory acts. All of these things becoming more and more aggressive in trying to cement the idea that Parliament and the King are supreme, and Americans resist more and more. Civil disobedience, outright resistance. Eventually, it turns into the full-blown Revolutionary War. Skipping quickly, George Washington was a pretty cool guy, pretty good at running away. And with the guerrilla war, that's pretty handy. So he gets through the war. We saw that, in general, African Americans and Native Americans were not routinely on one side. Does anyone remember what that idea of Dunmore Proclamation was? Like, that was kind of a deep cut there. No worries if you don't remember that one there. But, yeah, you want to Yeah, so we see a loyalist from the supporting the crown. He was recruiting African American soldiers with the promise of freedom if they fight for the British. So again, one side is actually practicing slavery, and the other side is encouraging it, but is also promising freedom. So really, the ideological stuff led to division, and Native Americans are kind of watching this and wondering which side is going to be better for us. So really, they kind of try to play each other off of each other until the time as well, only Americans showed up. Now, ultimately, France bails us out. Pretty cool. They win. Now, we did see that at the same time, the American Revolution inspires the French Revolution. French inspires a bunch of other revolutions around the world there. So we start to see this idea of a government based on natural rights and Enlightenment values. That's catching on now. Now, at the same time, we did see that there are other lingering issues here, particularly because in the early days, well, there are issues about how much do we really want to honor these issues regarding France. France goes to war against Britain. Do we want to actually help them out? There's a whole rap battle in regards to Hamilton about this. We saw it in class. It had sparkles. I don't know why. It was someone's autistic special interest. And so we saw at the same time, there was also issues about where do the borders really end? We saw that issues like Pinckney's Treaty are going to better decide who gets the territory around the Mississippi River, what fishing rights are allowed, where does the border of Florida end? So there was a lot to figure out in regards to other countries in the early days. And naturally, we are still having wars with Native Americans. All right? Any questions about that? Cool.
Culture time, culture time. What regions of the United States are influenced by different cultures? It's kind of the idea in this theme right here. In the Southwest, because of the legacy of Spanish colonization, we do see that it's in these French colonized regions. That's where we see the strongest presence of Catholicism. The biggest Catholic areas in the United States, even in the present day, were originally French or Spanish colonies. Louisiana, for example, and places like Arizona. But getting back to kind of the English parts of the colonies for a second, we're going to see that the idea of salutary neglect, this separation, contributes to an American national identity, a kind of separate from English culture. But a big part of that actually is going to be because of religion. Religion is a symbol of various different divisions in society because of kind of the nature of how these colonies were founded. New England tends to be a bit more monolithic. The middle colonies tend to be more pluralistic. And in the South, we do see not a big emphasis on religion all that much. But the big event of the early colonial period is the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was the one with guys like Jonathan Edwards, for example. Who remembers what Jonathan Edwards' kind of message was to the people? He had a very big speech called Sinners at the Hands of an Angry God. Who remembers kind of the message of that sermon? Yes. Exactly. If you don't pay attention in APUSH, that is a sin. You could go to hell if you commit that sin. You got to come to Jesus and go back to the faith. I'm looking at you, Marquise. Yes. Predestination. Yeah, it's kind of a rejection of that, though, in a way, because of the idea of I can change my ways. That's going to be a profound influence on the second Great Awakening. We can change society to make it better. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First Great Awakening, though, opens the doors to challenge the idea that things are set in stone. The guys you should know for that, Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield or Whitfield. But guess what? Religious freaking tolerance. Rhode Island, for example. Roger Williams was the guy who was chill with women, Native Americans, and non-Protestants. He allowed a lot of people into his colony. And it does beg the question, is America a diverse place? Are we a melting pot? And does that contribute to a separate culture from the rest of the world? We're German, we're Irish, we're African. All of these different things contribute to the American cultural identity. And speaking of kind of African cultural identity, slavery does develop a distinct African American culture. One of the biggest effects of the transversal of slaves to the United States is going to be the migration of West African traditions. What do we call that merging of different ideas together? Going back to AP World for a second, there's religious syncretism. Thank God. All right. Culture in the Revolutionary period. Well, we do see that kind of the regions of the United States are different in where they support the revolution. The Northeast tended to be the most revolutionary. Urban centers tend to have more a revolutionary progressive values compared to the South. So this idea of rural versus urban does play into cultural and political divides in the United States, or what becomes the United States. In terms of what American culture is, it isn't just hot dogs and hamburgers and, racism, but it is things like identity with the Enlightenment, for example. The Enlightenment produced kind of architecture that was inspired by neoclassicism. Neoclassicism, for those that didn't take Euro, that's basically Americans cosplaying as Romans and Greeks. I mean, you look at the White House, you look at Washington, D.C., these places are good examples of Federalist architecture, columns, arches, domes, all of those stupid Roman features. We're going to use them as well. But we also worship guys like George Washington. George Washington didn't tell a lie. Benjamin Franklin was super hot. All of these things contribute to American hero worship. But then you get back to that divide between regions in the United States. One of the biggest issues going forth in this class is divisions between the North and the South. And that partially has to do with the local economy. Because the South is based on plantations, its system is based on slavery as a result. That has a big effect on politics and culture as well. And as such, it helps explain the divide between the political parties. Democratic Republicans, their strongest support was in the South. I know it looks like I'm pointing to hell, but it was in the South. Whereas in the North, it was the strongest support for the Federalist Party. All right. Any questions thus far? July 4th, we celebrate an Independence Day. God bless America. All right.
And one last one here. So, with that in mind here, we've kind of covered this first part in so many ways here. So basically just what we saw in period one, kind of the same stuff socially. Native Americans are more equal than Europeans. The exception here, technically, Aztecs and Incas count as Native Americans, if you want to be specific, and they did, all kinds of brutal, hierarchies, colonization, human sacrifice, pretty nasty stuff. So, other than that, they are pretty good. However, we do see that, in general, once the Europeans show up, is when the idea of racial hierarchy comes with them. So that Costas system there, that was designed to include Europeans at the very top and, well, Native Americans and the locals at the very bottom. We saw that this is also kind of when slavery becomes a key part of that society there. And really the culture of it is this culture of exclusion. We see slaves have hardly any rights. They are born into this position and will die there, which is a huge departure from slavery in other forms before this in world history. And so we see that it is a really horrible system, that idea of chattel slavery, where slaves are property and are effectively subhuman. Now, at the same time, we did see several different types of resistance, including, well, the Pueblo Revolt for Native Americans. Other results we saw in earlier times, well, later times we get to like the Stono Rebellion in period 2. We see Gaspar Yanga, he's a guy from those maroon communities. So we see uprisings about the system. People didn't just take it sitting down. Meanwhile, moving on here socially, looking at issues like gender, we start to see issues like women's rights begin to pop up more. And again, the Puritans had a pretty patriarchal society going back to ye olden days of the Bible. But we did see that in the colonies, there were some women who managed to inherit property if they were unmarried, if they had no brothers or fathers, if all the men in their family were dead, women did inherit things. We saw one example here, Eliza Pinckney. She's a full-blown plantation owner, was a South Carolina like socialite. She has all kinds of up-and-coming stuff. And again, she owns slaves. So we see that some women got economic prosperity, most sadly did not, especially once women got married. So in future units, when we see like the mill girls, where they would willingly go to like a brutal factory job, it was because now they could make their own money instead of having to just give it up when they got married and just go to a life of domesticity and waiting on their husband instead of their father. We saw that hierarchy there. It keeps going. But what we do see is that in these other countries, we do see that there was some level of blending. Like again, we saw that casta system, race mixing was very prominent. In the English colonies, race mixing is kind of taboo. It does not happen very much. And people that are conceivably seen as Black don't really have rights. And so we see that in general, people who were African Americans or slaves were kind of separate from white society. So there's this literal like dividing line right there. They don't really mix. Now, at the same time, especially back in Unit 4, we're going to see this later, that African Americans kind of had their own cultures so that there was at least some joy in their lives in this brutal system here. But at the same time, even though both groups ended up becoming Christians because of the years of oppression, we do see some saw God in a way to like resist and, you know, provide for breaking of chains. Others saw class hierarchy as an ordained thing. People would use the scriptures of God to indoctrinate people or accept their place. We even saw back in the first week of this class something called the curse of Ham. The idea there that black skin is the punishment for way back in the Bible day when Noah's son saw him naked or something. And so the idea there is that they can use the scripture to then support segregation and inequality, or they can use it to oppose it. So at the same time, we saw that a lot of the colonies, a lot of these people have inferiority complexes as well. Europeans still look down at them as just filthy colonizers. No, as, what's the word? Colonials. And so we saw that there's kind of the beginning of like this kind of Southern gentry culture where they make their own elitism to resist that. But it also starts to lead to that division by region here, where Catholics, due to their connections to Europe, are now seen as bad in Protestant land. And so one last thing here, we saw that at the same time, the American Revolution, well, we kind of read a whole historian article about this back to Howard Zinn, Gordon Wood. Some say it was like a total leveling field. Everyone's equal now. Everyone's got opportunities. Every man a lord. But the revolution was started by rich guys. We do see rich people were in power before and after the revolution. We see that women didn't have a lot of rights after the revolution either. Slavery still around after the revolution. So we saw a whole debate there about really to what extent did the revolution affect social structures. And really, you can make an argument pretty convincingly for either side. But we do see that after this, we do see some areas, especially up in the north, that don't rely on the labor. We see this beginning of slowly getting rid of slavery. Some states get rid of it over time. Some start to phase it out. Some even compensate slave owners to release their slaves. So little by little, we see that slavery begins to disappear from the north. Meanwhile, it was going down in the South, and then the cotton gin shoots it right back up. And so at the same time, we saw that, yeah, this Republican motherhood idea was kind of seen as a step up for women's rights. That yes, they are still being mothers and having to do all the childbearing, but they might be able to go to college now and get an education to teach their kids how to be George Washington. So it was seen as kind of a progressive movement at the time, given the context. Now, at the same time, rebellions are still happening. Quakers, lifelong pacifists, don't like slavery. We'll see that becomes a bigger issue later on in units 4 and 5. And lastly, just in general, we are seeing that rich and poor is another unspoken dividing line here, as more indentured servants resist their slave masters and other issues like that. All right, very quick. I know it's late. Any questions about any of that?
All right, thank you guys. So what I would suggest to do with this information is to kind of see what did you take away from today and what might you need to study more about. This is not an exhaustive list of everything, but it's just some things that could be on the exam. Thank you guys so much. God bless America.